church when the Anzac Day is commemorated throughout Australia. But we know that here in Sorell, as in other cities and towns throughout Australia, we will stop to remember Anzac Day. And so we look at Anzac Day 2021. And I often wonder what makes Anzac Day such an important national tradition. What is it that we celebrate on what many believe is one of Australia's most sacred national holidays? Ironically, Anzac Day is not a holiday to celebrate a great Australian military victory. In fact, as we know, Gallipoli was a complete military disaster. My beer's not working. Thank you. Cheers. So this was the Anzacs at Gallipoli. And anybody who knows the Anzac story, of course, knows it was a complete military disaster. Ill-conceived, ill-planned, and through no fault of the Anzac soldiers that were disembarked on Anzac Bay, they were never ever going to take anything but a small part of the beach and then make a little bit of a headway up the hill. It isn't just the fact that 8,709 diggers died on April the 25th, 1915, and in the weeks that followed. It has little to do with the 9 Victoria Crosses that were won by Australians in that campaign. So what is it that we commemorate on Anzac Day? I think there are 2 main elements that spring to mind that have gone deep within the Australian psyche when we think of Anzac Day. The first is the idea of mateship, and the second element is sacrifice. Sacrifice of the few that many more might live. With this in mind, it's not surprising that for most Australians, the most iconic figure of Anzac Day was someone who in fact wasn't a fighting soldier at all. This hero never carried a gun. The fact he was an ambulance man. In fact, it was this man. Still not working. This man. You know, John Simpson Kirkpatrick. Better known to us simply as John Simpson. I don't know why he dropped off his last name when he signed up, but we know as John Simpson, but his real name was John Simpson Kirkpatrick. Simpson was a digger with a donkey who carried the wounded soldiers out of the battle zone at Gallipoli. Simpson enlisted in Western Australia on the 3rd Field Ambulance Medical Corps. He did so simply as John Simpson, and he, as much as anyone in that battle, sums up the 2 ideals of mateship and sacrifice. After the landing at Anzac Cove in Gallipoli, John Simpson found a donkey at an abandoned Turkish hut, and during the weeks that followed, he used a donkey to bring wounded men down to the beaches from the trenches up on the hills. Apparently, Simpson managed to transport about 12 to 15 men per day. He gave the wounded soldiers first aid in the trenches before loading them on his donkey and bringing them to the field hospital, which was located down on the beach. His route up the hills was along a gully that the Anzacs ironically called Shrapnel Gully. If you ever look at it, we'll see what we mean by Shrapnel Gully. Oh, that's Simpson and his donkey. That's Shrapnel Gully. You can see that it just looks like total ambush country. You've got to come up the middle of the valley and your enemy surrounds all the high country. This aptly named Shrapnel Gully was the main route up to the hills and was constantly shelled by the Turks as well as coming under constant sniper fire. It was here at Shrapnel Gully that Simpson was killed on May the 19th, 1915. He was bringing the wounded man down to the beach when he was hit by a sniper's bullet. John Simpson, like so many other Anzacs at Gallipoli, died young. He died at 23 years old. Padre George Green, who eventually led Simpson's funeral service, said this of John Simpson: If ever a man deserved the Victoria Cross, it was Simpson. I often remember now the scene I saw frequently in Sorell Gully, that of a cheerful soul calmly walking down the gully with the Red Cross armlet tied around the donkey's head. The gully was under direct fire from the enemy almost all the time. What led Simpson to put his own life at such risk? Maybe he could not have put it clearly into words himself. Perhaps he just knew in his heart it was the right thing to do. In any case, he willingly chose to risk his own life to save the life of his friends. Jesus said and demonstrated that greater love has no one than this, that he laid down his life for his friends. After just 24 days at Gallipoli, on the night of the 18th and 19th of May 1915, and after countless trips up and down Shrapnel Gully, Simpson did lay down his life for his friends. There are various accounts of how John Simpson lost his life. But according to his mate, Andy Davison, he was shot through the heart by a machine gun bullet as he was making his way down the gully. Davison and others were working at the top of the gully. After Simpson fell beside his donkey, they went back and covered his body and moved it to a dugout beside the gully while they carried on. They came back for him that evening, and he was buried at Hell Spit the same night. A simple wooden cross with the name John Simpson marked his grave. Some 2,000 years before, Jesus was led to teach people through a parable about another man with a donkey. When a teacher of the Jewish law tried to trap Jesus by asking him, "What must I do to receive eternal life?" And Jesus answered his question with a question. "What is written in the law? What do you read there?" The man said. "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbour as yourself." "You are right," Jesus replied. "Do this, and you will live." But the teacher of the law wanted to justify himself. So he asked Jesus, "Who is my neighbour?" Well, of course, we know that Jesus told him the parable of another man with a donkey. It was the Good Samaritan. This man stopped to help a Jewish man who had been attacked by robbers on the dangerous road from Jerusalem to Jericho. He gave him first aid and put him on his donkey and took him to an inn where he paid to have him cared for. It's hard for us sometimes to understand how confronting this story was for those who were listening to Jesus that day. The fact that Jesus' parable no doubt shocked and offended the Jewish listeners. Why would Jesus use a Samaritan, of all people, to be the hero in his parable? Who were these Samaritans, and why were they so despised as enemies of the Jewish people? Well, to answer this question, you've got to go back in biblical history. We first encountered the Samaritans in 2 Kings in the year of 721 to 22. Israel has been invaded by the Assyrians, and they've sacked its capital, Shechem. The Assyrian Emperor Sargon has a policy in which he deports all of his conquered cities' leading families to other parts of his empire and replaces them with foreigners. It is these foreigners that would in time intermarry with Israelites left in Israel. But all did not go well for the foreigners in Israel. And when the Lord sent lions amongst them, the people appealed to Sargon to send them a priest of the God of Israel, that they may learn to appease the God of the land. Sargon did send a priest, and he did teach the people to worship the Lord. But just in modern day India, the Lord was just added to numerous gods that the people worshipped. So you see, the Jews believed that the Samaritans were at best half-breeds who had a history of opportunism. When things were going well for Israel, they tried to claim they were Israelite. But when Israel hit hard times, they quickly reclaimed their Assyrian forefathers. It was these people that would become the spy Samaritans of Jesus' time. When we think on Anzac Day, and remember the account of Simpson and his donkey, we can be forgiven to think that parable of the Good Samaritan sounds amazingly similar. And in many ways it is. But there's one key difference. There's one vital exception. The Good Samaritan was not a Jewish man's mate. He was, in fact, the injured man's enemy. You see, for John Simpson, as for most of us, our neighbour is our mates. Mateship is one of the key messages of Anzac Day. It's a message that has been reinforced in every war the Australians have ever fought in. Mateship, I believe, was a hard lesson that the first British settlers learnt in the early days in settling this country. There was a time when people struggled to establish themselves in what was totally foreign country. I remember talking to one person, a historian, who said, can you imagine how it would have been with the people writing back to Britain from Australia and saying, what a strange land. It's so strange that even the trees are different. Here the leaves stay on and the bark falls off. And of course the people back in Britain would go, what? Well, as we know in the gum, that's true. So the new settlers knew that they had to stick together if they were to survive in this new land. And they had to help each other if they were to make it. And that's one of the things that Australian can, I believe, can be proud of. It's one of the earliest rules that they learned is to be Australian, that you always stick by your mates. You're always there for each other. You can always depend on them. Men like John Simpson took that a stage further and died for his mates. So we think we know what it means to be a good Samaritan. We know who our neighbour is. But when Jesus tells us the story, the original Good Samaritan, the Good Samaritan doesn't look after his mate. He looks after his enemy. He comes along the road and sees a Jew lying there. As an enemy, he should have quickly walked past him on the other side of the road, just as Jesus explained others had done. Well, that's not what he does, is it? He stops to help him. He risked being attacked by the same robbers that attacked this Jewish man. And why? For the sake of a Jew? As a good Jew, this man wouldn't have given him the time of day as a Samaritan. He bandages his wounds, puts him on his donkey, pays good money for him to be looked after at an inn, and promises to return to cover any extra costs incurred in his care. As a Samaritan, he knows he can't expect to get any thanks for his kindness. A good law-abiding Jew of the time could never admit to his mates that his life was saved by a Samaritan. Samaritans would never do such a thing. Better to say that it was a priest or a Levite who stopped to help him and saved his life. You see, the trouble with the Samaritan is he went too far. What if everyone started making mates out of enemies? We had to make a mockery out of everything we've ever said about our enemies, let alone the way we've treated them. I knew what Jesus said, but it's too hard. Is it? In that First World War, there was a rare moment of peace. It was reported in the British press. It was Christmas Eve in 1914. The trenches in Flanders. And amongst the mud and the blood and horror of that campaign, a message was sent from one line to the other. And it said, if your guys don't fire, no, if your side does not fire, we won't either on Christmas Day. This became known as the Christmas Day Truce of 1914. It was a spontaneous ceasefire on the bloody battlefields of Flanders, during which the British and German troops came out of their trenches to shake hands, sing Christmas carols, and even play a little soccer. You see, yesterday's enemies on Christmas Day in 1914 became today's friends. The next day, can we have a look? This is actually the guys enjoying a game of soccer. The next day was Boxing Day. The trenches were quiet as both the German and British troops just stopped fighting. It didn't seem right to fire bullets at the guys they were playing soccer with yesterday. In fact, it took an order from the military high command stating that any soldier who refused to recommence hostilities would be taken out and shot. It was only that order that made the men continue. Yet through this example we get a glimpse of what would happen if we took Jesus at his word and learned to love our enemies. I believe that it's appropriate as we think of this today, not just because it's Anzac weekend, but because just a few weeks ago we celebrated Easter. When we think of another person who rode into Jerusalem on a donkey. When I think about it, I believe Jesus was the ultimate Good Samaritan. He certainly knew who his neighbour was. The trouble was, it was everyone. Even the ones his own community shunned. And we know, much to the disgust of the self-righteous religious leaders of the time. They actually accused Jesus of being a friend of tax collectors and sinners. I'm sure Jesus wore that as a badge of honour. It's true that Jesus made friends with many people who the Jewish people saw as enemies. Roman centurions, Roman collaborators, prostitutes and other social outcasts. All he saw as neighbours. And his own people, the people who should have been his real mates, didn't like it. They didn't like the idea that they were so threatened by it, they ended up nailing him to a cross. But then that's what you get when you follow the radical teachings that Jesus said. Jesus like this teaching. But I tell you who hear me, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who mistreat you. If someone strikes you on one cheek, turn to him the other also. If someone takes your cloak, do not stop him from taking your tunic. I don't know about you, but I think this is really hardcore teaching. You see, I'm the kind of guy who wants grace for myself, but justice for everybody else. It's just a natural thing, isn't it, really? But this is hardcore teaching. It's hardcore because it's nice to say the words and go, oh, yeah, that's what Jesus said. But he didn't expect you just to hear your word. He expected you to do it. That's where it comes to the crunch time. Many years ago, I was sent by the fire service up to Brisbane for meetings. And we had a gap in the meetings. And it was a beautiful day, and it was the middle of winter here in Hobart. And I'd left a cold day, and I'd got up there, and it was in the mid-20s. And I thought, wow, this is fantastic. So I went to a park. They call it, oddly enough, Anzac Park. And I was sitting in the park, and there was this old guy sitting on a bench. And I said, g'day, and I sat down and had a chat to this old fella. And he kept looking up and as the tourists were going by and muttering to himself. So when I got talking and he found out that I was from Hobart and he felt a little bit more relaxed, he said, you know, son, we may have won the war, but they won the peace. And I looked at this old fella. I said, oh. He said, yeah. You see, for this old guy, I found out that he'd been a prisoner of war of the Japanese. And as he was sitting in Anzac Park in the sun, possibly remembering all the mates that he'd lost and all the horrors that he had endured, he saw Japanese tourists walking through the park and taking photographs. It was then that I realised just how hard Jesus' teaching is. How much it would take for this man to be able to turn the other cheek and love his enemies after what had been put through. And as hard as that may seem, that's exactly what Jesus was saying. You see, even though we were his enemies, totally opposed to him, God didn't walk past you and me when we were lay dying. He sent Jesus. He found us. He fixed up our wounds and carried us to safety. Jesus saved our lives through his sacrifice. And he did it not for people who were his mates. He did it for people who were his enemies. People who turned their backs on him, people who ignored him, people who had gone their own way. Jesus spoke the unspoken rule for us. He broadened the belief which says that you always help your mates by making mates of everyone. Jesus treated us, his enemies, as if we were his best mates. He didn't let us down. In fact, he gave his own life to save us. And that gives us not just a new life, but a power to change things. Is it possible for us to love our enemies? I don't think it comes naturally to people to do that. But I believe in a God of miracles. And I believe that with God's help you can. Can we love those who hate us? When we think about that, if we could do that, imagine the possibilities. A world where there's no more enemies, no more conflicts. So is this kind of pipe dream? I don't believe it is. You see, between 1914 and 1918, Australia and Turkey were enemies. Yet after the First World War in 1934, the Turkish president, himself a Gallipoli veteran, wrote these words of comfort to Australians who had lost their loved ones at Gallipoli, which are memorialised, so to say, on this commemorative plaque. That's it there. And these are the words. You can't quite read on that one. If we go to the next slide, this is what it says. Those heroes that shed their blood and lost their lives, you are now lying in the soil of a friendly country. Therefore, rest in peace. There is no difference between Johnnies and the Mehmets to us. Where they lie side by side now here in this country of ours. Your mothers who sent their sons from faraway countries, wipe away your tears. Your sons are now lying in our bosom and are in peace. After having lost their lives on this land, they have become our sons as well. Sadly, these heartfelt words of the Turkish president were to be shattered when just 5 short years later in 1939, the world again was plunged into World War. So would Jesus' teaching of loving your enemies ever be realised? To answer that question, I believe we must return to the Scriptures, to where God made a promise to the prophet Micah. The words that give mankind hope. Hope to imagine a world where war will be no more. And these are the words. He will judge between many peoples and will settle disputes with strong nations far and wide. They will beat their swords into plowshares and spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not take up sword against nation, nor will they train for war any more. Every man will sit under his own vine and under his own fig tree, and no one will make them afraid, for the Lord Almighty has spoken. What a mighty promise. It may happen, it may not happen in our lifetimes. But Scripture is clear. A time is coming when God will establish a world where there'll be no more mourning. There'll be no more mourning over dead friends and family who have died in war or through some act of terrorism or hate. A time where there will be no more tears and pain at the tragic loss of our loved ones' lives. But in the meantime, we as Christians have a task to do. We have to try our best to expand that wonderful old Australian principle of loving your mates. And we have to include as much as we can possibly can everyone else within that wonderful love. Can we really take Jesus at his word and love our enemies? For Jesus, he not only taught it, He actually showed us by example how it works. We need to learn to love our enemies, I believe, enough to share with them the amazing grace of our God, which brings the possibility of peace to us all. Peace not only with God, but peace with each other. For me, Abraham Lincoln encapsulated Jesus' teaching on loving our enemies best when he said these words: I destroy my enemies when I make them my friends. Wise words from Abraham Lincoln, who saw what Jesus had written, knew how hard it was, but then understood them to put them in a simple phrase like that. So this Anzac Day, let's put it in our hearts to try and ask God to help us a little bit more to move on from hate, to move on from prejudice, and take us to a place where we can start to love our enemies. Let's pray. Father, as we commemorate Anzac Day 2021, we ask that the sacrifices made by so many to ensure our freedom may not be in vain. Today, as we reflect over the 100,000 Australian lives lost to war, we ask you help to change our hearts so we can see others through your eyes, so we, like Jesus, can love our enemies. Help us, Lord, to realise that the most powerful weapon on earth is love, and it is love that conquers all. Lord, on this day, when we remember all of those we have lost to war, may we find comfort in your promise that you made, that there will come a time when nation will not take sword against nation, nor will they train for war anymore. And now I'd just like to leave it open. If you'd like to say a prayer, maybe for a loved one lost, maybe just for our country, then please feel free to do that.